It began with a phone call. No one expected an urgent summons from King Charles, delivered not through aides or formal letters, but directly. The king's voice was cold, his message brief. What followed was a private family meeting unlike any other, shattering royal norms and igniting a storm of whispers behind locked palace doors. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The corridors of Buckingham Palace fell into a strange and stifling silence that afternoon, as if the walls themselves had caught wind of the storm about to break. The king, usually known for measured deliberation and an almost cautious adherence to formality, bypassed every channel of royal protocol. He made the calls himself one by one, summoning only a select few to attend a private meeting within Windsor's most secluded chamber. Notably, several prominent members of the royal household were left in the dark, omitted without explanation. Whispers began to circulate even before the guests arrived. Why this sudden meeting? Why now? And more importantly, why them? No aides were allowed. No private secretaries permitted. Staff were ordered to leave their posts near the meeting room. Whatever was about to unfold, King Charles wanted no witnesses, only the blood relatives he'd chosen to confront. A cloud of anticipation, thick with fear and suspicion, hovered over every marble hallway. The family was walking into the unknown. Behind every stiff upper lip was a racing mind. Why this level of secrecy? What breach of trust could be so severe that Charles himself would go to such lengths? Behind the scenes, an intense power struggle had been brewing, quiet and unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. Subtle slights during public appearances, conflicting positions in private councils, and mounting tensions over succession and legacy had created fissures in the already fragile family dynamic. Prince William had grown colder toward certain family members. Princess Anne had become unusually guarded. Even Queen Camilla was rumoured to have withdrawn from key engagements, sensing that something was shifting in the royal tide. The phrase, "this ends now," reportedly muttered by King Charles before the meeting, carried a chilling finality. It was a declaration of war not against outsiders, but within the very fabric of the royal family. The chosen attendees walked in with forced grace, but carried the weight of 1,000 uncertainties. Every nod, every glance exchanged in the antechamber brimmed with tension. Behind closed doors, allegiances were tested and grievances laid bare. There were no speeches prepared, no ceremonial scripts. This wasn't the monarchy on display. This was the monarchy behind the curtain, confronting itself in raw, unfiltered confrontation. But as the family gathered behind gilded doors, unaware of what was coming, King Charles prepared to deliver a reckoning that would change everything. Not one, but 3 names were on the king's private list, names that once basked in royal favour, now on the verge of disgrace. As whispers turned to panic, one question loomed: what had they done to warrant the unthinkable? In the moments following King Charles's closed-door address, the atmosphere turned glacial. All eyes locked on him, awaiting a clarification that never softened the blow. Without theatrics, he read the names aloud. 3 titles, historic, powerful and sacred, were about to be stripped away. The first name sent a jolt through the room. A royal whose public image was meticulously curated, often portrayed as the peacekeeper. Behind the veil, however, their private dealings told a darker tale: covert financial maneuverings, alliances with tabloid figures, and quiet resistance to the king's reforms. The second name was more expected, someone long rumoured to be at odds with Charles, whose refusal to step back after a scandal had been a source of friction. The final name, however, left everyone breathless. This royal had maintained silence, rarely took the spotlight, and yet had somehow earned the king's ire through quiet acts of rebellion buried beneath layers of discretion. Charles didn't offer explanations, he didn't need to. The room knew. Each of them had played a part in undermining the vision he'd worked to forge. Decades of passive power struggles had built to this moment. The first individual was defiant, rising from their seat with thinly veiled contempt, challenging the king's authority in a single icy glance. The second sat frozen, stunned into silence, their world crumbling beneath the weight of shame. The third said nothing at all, no defense, no denial, just a faint, knowing nod that suggested this reckoning had been long expected. It wasn't just about protocol or policy. It was personal. Behind palace walls, the three names had been the subject of heated whispers for months. Each had taken a different path to fall out of favour, yet all were accused of one common sin: betrayal of trust. Evidence had emerged, confidential communications intercepted, advisors leaking reports of obstruction and suspicious interference in sensitive royal planning. The manipulation wasn't blatant. It was subtle, calculated, and quiet, until it wasn't. Until the consequences could no longer be delayed. This wasn't simply a correction, it was a purge, and in the middle of it all stood Queen Camilla. Her presence was quiet, her expression unreadable, but her influence was unmistakable. Court insiders have long murmured about her increasing sway behind palace doors. Some claimed she had pressed Charles to act. Others whispered that she merely stood back and watched the collapse unfold, knowing full well that a new order was rising, one that perhaps she helped shape. Whether she orchestrated the events or merely benefited from them, her shadow loomed over every decision made that day. But stripping titles was just the beginning, because what King Charles revealed next shook even the most battle-hardened royals to their core. The royal family has weathered scandal before, but this time, the betrayal wasn't from outsiders, it was from within. King Charles had uncovered a trail of lies, secret deals, and personal attacks that left him feeling cornered and furious. It began with a letter, small, handwritten, and discreetly passed between two of the three royals, whose titles now hung by a thread. Meant to remain private, its contents were damning. A veiled discussion about undermining the king's authority, subtly suggesting alternative strategies for steering the monarchy's future without Charles's knowledge or consent. The language was calculated, not overtly treasonous, but it danced dangerously close to insubordination. But that letter wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. What followed was a cascade of revelations that exposed something far more intricate, a covert operation to reshape the monarchy's future, not with Charles at the centre, but around newer, more controllable figures. And in that plan, Catherine and her children were obstacles, not heirs. The betrayal hit where it hurt most, at the heart of legacy. Hidden communications showed quiet efforts to sideline Charles in key strategic decisions, with several proposals regarding public roles, patronage, and constitutional positioning being rerouted or delayed under the guise of advisory revisions. These weren't accidents, they were coordinated, and Charles, once known for turning the other cheek, could no longer ignore the mutiny hiding in plain sight. What made it worse was the whisper campaign that followed, stories carefully planted to frame Charles as disconnected, slow, and emotionally unfit to guide the next era. The king realized he wasn't just being challenged, he was being erased. But it wasn't only politics. A confidential dossier found its way to Charles's inner circle, one detailing questionable financial activities tied to royal privileges, lavish spending under charitable umbrellas, donations redirected, properties exploited. It was a scandal waiting to erupt. Charles saw clearly now this wasn't a simple family disagreement. It was a network of entitlement threatening the crown's integrity, using the institution's prestige as a shield while tearing at its foundation from within. And standing beside him through this emotional hurricane was Prince William. Once hesitant to step into the storm, William now demanded action. Sources close to the palace say his voice rose above the others in that meeting, insisting that those who jeopardized the family's future be held accountable, regardless of title, status, or blood. For King Charles, the personal weight of betrayal was unlike anything he'd faced before. These weren't political opponents or scandal-hungry press agents. These were people he had shared decades of tradition with: holidays, weddings, grief, triumph. And now they had turned on him with surgical precision. In private, he was said to have walked palace halls alone the night before the meeting, eyes tired, jaw clenched. No anger, just heartbreak, dressed as determination. When he finally stood before the gathered royals to explain his decision, there was no outburst, no theatrics, only truth laid bare in a voice that no longer trembled. He didn't seek permission. He delivered consequence. As the king laid out his reasons with cold resolve, what followed was not just punishment but public erasure. No cameras, no press, no ceremony, just silence, tension, and finality. Within the walls of Windsor, a chilling ritual unfolded where words replaced swords, and legacy was dismantled by decree. The room where it happened was devoid of splendor. Gone were the emblems of majesty, the glittering ornaments of power. What remained was a stripped-down space, cloaked in silence, where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of what was about to transpire. There was no pomp to soften the blow, only a polished table, a stack of sealed documents, and the presence of a monarch who had shed sentiment in favor of steel. King Charles stood not as a father, a brother, or an uncle, but as the crown itself, and when he began to speak, the tension broke like ice underfoot. No speeches, no elaborate preambles, just 3 names read aloud with slow precision, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. For those who bore them, it wasn't just status being revoked, it was history unraveling. The act was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Each stripped title was followed by a symbolic motion, a signet removed, a document passed across the table and signed, the royal seal pressed not in wax, but in cold finality. The insignias tokens, once worn, with pride, were handed over without resistance by some, clutched in hesitation by others. Charles never raised his voice, yet his authority echoed louder than any proclamation. He wasn't merely revoking names from a ledger, he was severing lifelines from a dynasty that had already bled too much from within. One by one, the emblems of privilege were surrendered, and with each handover the gravity of what was being done grew heavier. Across the room, eyes darted, some wet with disbelief, others burning with fury. Princess Anne, unmoving, kept her arms crossed and jaw locked. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her presence had the weight of judgment, as though she too had grown tired of excuses and entitlement. Rumours later swirled that it was Anne who had encouraged Charles to stop delaying the inevitable. Her expression in that moment wasn't triumphant, it was resolute, as if carrying out a sentence long overdue. Prince William remained expressionless, focused, his loyalty to the future outweighing sentiment tied to the past. Not a single royal dared to interrupt. No one objected, because the line had already been crossed, and the king had made it clear this wasn't an open forum. This was a verdict. And then came Charles's final words. Quiet, but deliberate. "You've left me no choice." A sentence that carried more weight than 1,000 accusations. It wasn't anger that guided him, it was necessity. He hadn't acted in rage, he had acted in defense of a crumbling institution. The message was unmissable, the crown will not be mocked, and no name is sacred when loyalty is betrayed. No applause followed, no comfort was offered. Just the sound of retreating footsteps and doors closing behind those whose titles had just been erased from the royal bloodline. But even as the titles fell, the aftermath outside the room promised a political firestorm, unlike any the firm had seen. By the next morning, royal courtiers were scrambling. News of the private meeting leaked, and though no names were confirmed, the kingdom was ablaze with speculation. The monarchy's walls weren't just breached, they were collapsing from the inside. Phones rang off the hook. Advisors who once exuded calm confidence now whispered frantically behind closed doors. Every palace across the Windsor network activated emergency protocols, staff rosters rewritten overnight. Security teams reassigned, and entry logs reviewed in reverse. Whatever Charles had unleashed in that historic private meeting, its aftershock hit like a thunderclap. The press caught wind almost immediately, not through official channels, but from a chain of unnamed insiders, each version slightly different, each detail more explosive than the last. Some claimed 3 royals had been stripped of their titles due to financial abuse. Others insisted it was about disloyalty and succession interference. The truth? Buried beneath layers of strategic silence. And that's exactly where the chaos thrived. Attempts to enforce a media blackout failed before they even began. By dawn, the internet was flooded. Headlines screamed of a royal purge. Blogs dissected past appearances, searching for signs of tension. Former staffers emerged from obscurity to add fuel to the fire. And then the hashtags started. Hashtag Royal Reckoning, hashtag Monarchy Meltdown, hashtag Charles Strikes Back. Each post, each theory, each photo added a fresh cut to a family already bleeding from within. No official statement was released. But silence, in moments like these, speaks louder than spin. And the silence only fueled the storm. Behind palace gates, households began shielding their own. Beatrice and Eugenie's circles quietly closed ranks, denying involvement but preparing for fallout. Prince Andrew's team, already bruised from years of disgrace, locked down all public access, and Harry's camp, still bruised from his ongoing estrangement, reportedly reached out through private intermediaries, not to express outrage, but to inquire, almost desperately, who was next. The monarchy's internal structure resembled a shaken hive. Trust was vaporizing, alliances shifted by the hour, and amidst it all, one couple stood poised at the center of it all. Catherine and William's team broke their silence with a cryptic statement, offering no confirmations, but affirming unwavering commitment to the crown's integrity. It was surgical, cold, and calculated, and it was read as one thing: "We stand with Charles." The language, subtle as it was, carried weight. Lines were being drawn, loyalty was being tallied, and those not counted were already behind enemy lines. Meanwhile, public sentiment fractured. Some praised the king's boldness, calling it the clean-up the monarchy needed. Others called it cruel, divisive, desperate. The court of public opinion was in session, and no royal was exempt. But for the palace, this wasn't a moment to debate, it was a battle to survive. Advisors worked around the clock to prevent more leaks, but it was clear the dam had already cracked. The monarchy wasn't just under scrutiny, it was under siege. And in a brutal twist, the next blow wasn't from the press, it came from within. Because amid the silence of stripped honours and sealed lips, one of the disgraced royals was preparing something unexpected, something explosive. And then came the ultimate betrayal when one of the stripped royals decided they wouldn't go quietly. As King Charles tried to restore order, a counterplot began brewing in the shadows. One of the disgraced royals launched a quiet but calculated campaign to dismantle the king's authority from within, and they weren't alone. The royal family had barely begun to process the magnitude of what had transpired when whispers of rebellion began to surface. While the palace scrambled to suppress public fallout, a different operation had already been set in motion, one led by a figure now exiled in status, but not in influence. Far from accepting disgrace, this royal retreated to a secluded countryside estate, where meetings began to unfold under the guise of private dinners and informal gatherings. But these weren't social affairs. They were war councils. Trusted allies, political strategists, and former aides with scores to settle gathered behind tightly guarded gates to plan something far more destabilizing than defiance. They were preparing to fracture the monarchy from the inside. Reports of encrypted messages and encrypted phone calls leaked to the outer palace circle, revealing troubling connections. Influential royal critics, some of whom had long-standing grievances with Charles's reign, had been brought into the fold. Media insiders promised a sympathetic platform. Foreign dignitaries, once dismissed as ceremonial contacts, were now rumoured to be in communication with the disgraced royals' emissaries. Old grudges were being rekindled in quiet, powerful places. There were murmurs of a coordinated release of private archives letters, emails, even voice memos kept from decades of royal life, some allegedly so damaging they could rewrite public perceptions of the monarchy's most guarded moments. At the heart of the plot was something far more audacious, a legal challenge. Private attorneys, quietly retained months earlier, were preparing a case to dispute the stripping of royal entitlements. This wasn't about vanity, it was about inheritance, power, and institutional legacy. There was talk of invoking obscure clauses buried deep in royal charters, talk of trusts, of bypass succession agreements, and beneath the legal jargon beat the pulse of revenge. This royal wasn't trying to regain a title, they were trying to ignite a constitutional crisis. King Charles, once known for his composed demeanour, was reportedly rattled. "Oh, Nay, source close to the monarch recalled his exact words, "They'll split the monarchy in two." He wasn't being dramatic, he was being honest. The firm had survived scandal, exile, and war, but it had never faced a civil war waged in private halls, with the crown as the battleground. The monarch was no longer simply defending tradition, he was defending survival. But in this war, the enemy wasn't foreign, it was blood. And the battlefield wasn't public, it was legacy. But just as the threat reached its peak, a voice from the past returned, one who hadn't spoken publicly in years. In the midst of royal chaos, an unexpected twist emerged. A sealed letter from Diana, long thought lost, surfaced from a private archive. Its contents were devastating, its timing suspiciously perfect. The letter was said to have been discovered in a locked collection known only to a handful of senior courtiers, buried among correspondence that had not been touched in decades. Written in Diana's unmistakable hand, it was addressed not to the crown, not to the public, but to her sons. The tone was intimate, aching, and eerily prophetic. Those who claimed to have read it describe words laced with both maternal tenderness and quiet alarm. She spoke of love, but also of danger, of loyalty, but also of betrayal, and most chilling of all, she warned of those who would one day wear the crown yet wound it from within. A line that sent tremors through every corridor it was whispered in. The letter reportedly alluded to tensions Diana sensed long before they surfaced, fault lines between duty and ambition, between legacy and ego. She wrote of Charles not as a villain, but as a man torn between what he feels and what he fears history will demand of him: guilt, regret, a lifelong struggle between affection and authority. Those close to the matter believe this revelation struck Charles deeply, reopening emotional wounds he had spent decades sealing behind ceremony and protocol. This wasn't political, it was personal, and it arrived at the exact moment his family was tearing itself apart. Prince William's reaction, according to insiders, was devastatingly human. He reportedly withdrew from all meetings the night the letter was shared, retreating into solitude. One aide later claimed he emerged hours later with reddened eyes, shaken, carrying not anger but resolve. The words of his mother, preserved across time, had cut through the noise of scandal and power, reaching the boy beneath the future king. For William, the message wasn't about the past. It was a warning about the future, about what happens when loyalty fractures and blood turns against blood. Camilla's response, however, was said to be starkly different. Palace whispers described her as white with rage, unsettled not only by the resurfacing of Diana's voice, but by the effect it had on the family dynamic. Old ghosts don't stay buried in the monarchy, they haunt, and Diana's sudden presence through ink and memory shifted the emotional balance overnight. Almost instantly, public sentiment followed. Diana's name surged across platforms, stories were reshared, tributes resurfaced. The Queen of Hearts, long absent from the royal narrative, reclaimed the centre of it. With the Queen of Hearts reawakened in spirit, and battle lines drawn in blood, the monarchy faced a question it had never dared to answer. As titles fell and allegiances fractured, attention turned to the future. Who would rise from the ashes? And with trust shattered across generations, was the crown still worth inheriting? The monarchy had survived scandal, loss, and betrayal, but never had its internal scaffolding looked so fragile. With 3 titles stripped, a wave of power vacuum swept through the royal family, each one begging the question of succession, stability, and future relevance. At the centre of it all stood Prince William, now visibly burdened not just by the weight of expectation, but by the magnitude of responsibility his father had thrust upon him. Insiders say Charles began positioning him more prominently, involving him in every confidential discussion, every delicate negotiation. But even among loyalists, murmurs grew: could William, tempered by trauma and duty, hold the line when the crown itself appeared to be bleeding from within? While eyes naturally fell on William, another figure quietly gained traction: Princess Charlotte. Though young, her presence in select private events and her increasing proximity to Catherine during major discussions had not gone unnoticed. The whispers began as speculation, but grew into strategic chatter. Charlotte, with her mother's poise, and her grandmother Diana, legacy, was already being prepared for something greater than ceremony. The firm, sensing the public's craving for a fresh, untarnished face, started recalibrating its focus, not only on who leads now, but on who could lead next. Meanwhile, veterans of the crown began shifting their roles. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, once steady presences in the background, now emerged as the quiet architects of transition. Behind closed doors, there was talk of a regency structure and interim framework designed to preserve stability should Charles be forced to step back amid the internal storm. Anne's reputation for no-nonsense discipline and Edward's measured diplomacy positioned them as the monarchy's firewall. But even within this plan, power was being recalibrated and not everyone welcomed the change. Camilla, once firmly planted beside the king, now stood on increasingly shaky ground. The Queen Consort's influence had waned since the private meeting. Her proximity to some of the disgraced royals raised uncomfortable questions, and rumours of a forced step-down veiled behind terms like transition in focus began circulating in senior circles. Some claimed Charles, despite his personal devotion, was preparing to reduce her visibility to preserve the monarchy's core. Others whispered she was resisting with everything she had left. But then came the most shocking development of all, a proposal for a new advisory council, one not centred around legacy royals, but built under Catherine's direction. A quiet yet formidable power block was being drawn up, led by William and Catherine, advised by Anne and Edward, with room for Charlotte's future voice. It wasn't just a response to the chaos, it was a reinvention. A monarchy stripped of illusion, reshaped with precision, ruthless, strategic, necessary. The monarchy was not collapsing, it was evolving in brutal real time, and this evolution didn't come with grace or grandeur. It came with cuts, silences, and reassignments, with bloodlines redrawn and old loyalties discarded like relics of a kingdom that no longer fit its own skin. And as this cold transformation unfolded, the question wasn't just who would inherit the crown, but what it would even look like by the time it was passed on. But before the dust could settle, one final confrontation would send shockwaves through the lineage of power. In a locked-door confrontation with no cameras, King Charles, William, and the last of the dissenting royals clashed in what palace insiders call the real end of the Second Elizabethan era. Voices were raised, ultimatums delivered, and then a chilling silence. The final confrontation was never scheduled, but it was always inevitable. With fractures widening and alliances shifting, Charles summoned the last of the inner circle's dissenters, one royal whose defiance had persisted beyond private meetings, leaked memos, and public disgrace. This wasn't about titles anymore. It was about survival. According to those familiar with the lead-up, Charles entered the room with a written ultimatum in hand and a resolve that had been months, if not decades, in the making. What unfolded behind those walls wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. The king laid out the terms plainly: fall in line with the crown's new direction, or walk away from it forever. The response came not in argument, but in a cold stare, followed by a slow, calculated rise from the chair. No goodbyes, no handshakes, just a vow quiet but laced with venom that they would never return. Within the hour, bags were packed, security reassigned, the royal exile had begun. Prince William remained behind, silent through most of the exchange, but unflinching. He wasn't just observing his father assert control, he was absorbing it. When the door closed for the final time, Charles reportedly turned to William and simply said, "It's yours to defend now." In that moment, the transition wasn't symbolic, it was real. William, once torn between diplomacy and duty, had become what insiders now call the Iron Heir, not cold, not cruel, but unyielding in his protection of the monarchy's future. Catherine, always composed and watchful, stood quietly in the background. She hadn't spoken much in the confrontation, but her silence was not absence, it was power. Later that evening, senior courtiers were overheard referring to her as the quiet victor, the one who never raised her voice but emerged as the monarchy's emotional cornerstone. Stability returned, but not familiarity. The monarchy that emerged from the ashes of that showdown was more streamlined, more guarded, and far more willing to make hard choices. The pageantry remained, but the tone had shifted: less romanticism, more resolve. Charles, who had once been accused of leading with hesitation, now stood firmer, colder, and entirely unwilling to entertain internal rebellion again. He had not only drawn a line in the sand, he had buried the past beneath it. In the weeks that followed, public appearances resumed, but everything beneath the surface had changed. The crown had not fallen. It had fortified itself. And in doing so, it had ended an era of tolerance for chaos dressed in bloodlines. The crown survived, but it didn't emerge unscathed. And as the world watches, one truth remains: the battle for the soul of the monarchy has only just begun. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.